Next, let's talk about static classes and singletons, as this is a pretty common case in a lot of the code reviews I do. Here we have a class called the outputter class. And if we look at the way it's being used, we can see here we're just using it as a singleton object. We're saying, oh, the outputter has an instance, and then we're going to call some method on that instance. And the idea behind this, if you're not that familiar with singletons, is that there is a single object that everyone can use. You're not having to create or craft up a new object just to use that. And very commonly, I'll see this pattern. And this pattern was pretty common early on in the C#'s lifetime, but has become pretty antiquated. The idea behind the pattern here was that I would have a class, but I would only allow a single instance of the class. In fact, I would have a static instance that represented the one and only instance of my object, and then I would control when it was actually created and with what parameters, and I'd use a private constructor to prevent anyone else from actually creating one. So the first person who asks for the instance, we create them a new one. If one already existed as a piece of static data, we would use it, and then we would write the rest of our interface inside this class, and that would be the interface on this one instance that everybody used. This is overly complex and not necessary anymore. I usually ask people to go ahead and refactor these to use what's called a static class. Static class is a special kind of class in C# that knows that there's only one instance. In fact, it knows that the type only has type members. So by saying a static class, you're implying a few things. One, that you only have static members, not instant members. And that two, construction of new instances of this object aren't going to be allowed. So because we have a static class, we no longer need a constructor. Now, if you have some static data you need to initialize, you can actually create a constructor called a static constructor. Now, this is called the first time someone needs to call the outputter class. So this happens once and only once inside of an app domain. So in many ways, you can control what is being created at that point. This wouldn't be public, doesn't need to be public. In fact, it can't be public because this is being called by the infrastructure of .NET. It's not being called directly by the user. And in that case, we can get rid of all this ugly static instance, I'll just comment out, of the singleton pattern, because all the members of our class are now static members. So not only does this eliminate the amount of code that is in this outputter class, right? It reduces the surface area of what we're producing here, but it also makes using it a lot easier because we know we're just saying outputter dot whatever the static member is. We're getting the same functionality because this static class isn't instantiated, the constructor isn't instantiated, this singleton in the language isn't instantiated until the first person requests it, and then it stays resident inside the app domain as long as you use it. So you're getting the same behavior that all this fancy code was doing for us. It's just not necessary anymore.